Morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's maybe good afternoon or maybe good night, depending on where you are. So thank you for navigating the time zones, and deep thanks to TC and Nora for first inviting me and organizing all of the logistics, and Nora again for that very generous introduction. I want to just start off by congratulating SIG-DITE on its wonderful work for the community. It's just been really rewarding to see the engagement in this organization and through this organization, a lot of energy around it. So you can see the benefits of it accrue very broadly to the field and positioning us in, just conducting excellent research, but also supporting each other in the process. So deep sense of appreciation to you. Um, and Nora, thank you for that very kind introduction, over the top, but thank you again. It's just a pleasure to be here. What I'm going to do is, as TC and Nora had suggested, I'll take 30, 45 minutes, just depending on, I'll try to keep it definitely within that range, to share some thoughts around formulating research problems. And you've seen some of the pre-reads already. So hopefully that will set us up for a nice conversation after my presentation or remarks here. So let me start off by introducing the idea of type 3 errors. And I would like to give you a little bit of a background here. You have seen this editorial, which I wrote, which was published in MISQ back in June 2017. I was the editor-in-chief at the time, and about a year and a half or so into my tenure in that role, and previously having served, of course, in other editorial roles, but also as an author, I sort of started seeing a pattern, which was intriguing in some ways. That is, papers that were well done were not were sort of not necessarily seen as um, contributing or raising a provocative or necessary question. So this got me thinking about patterns on why this might be happening. And what was quite striking in that process was just reflecting on those patterns and seeing that actually it came down to certain critical risks in the process, which were, a reasonable set of risks. And that motivated me to reflect on them and consolidate the thought process there in terms of the patterns I was observing. And I was fortunate to have conversations with a number of scholars, reviewers, other editors, authors, in terms of their own experiences. So a lot of this comes through that engagement, reflection process, and observing what I did. Ian Mitroff and Silvers put it very well in terms of when do type 3 errors occur? And that's, this idea of answering the wrong question, and I think, of course, this is a subjective construal using the right methods. So again, you can air quote those, but you sort of get the sense that there's just some misalignment. It's not about was the research well done? It was really about why does this matter? Why do we need to get into this space? And that proposition wasn't effectively addressed in the research process. So just by way of background again, if you look at Albert Einstein, he sort of also advocates strongly for the importance of the formulation of a problem. And I want you to just like to say that it's useful to see the transition here, not from the problem is essential or the problem is important, but rather the formulation of a problem is more essential than its solution. So the term shifts from what is the problem to how you are formulating it. And so they come into a distinct set of choices that researchers need to make in the process of formulating a problem. And this formulation, how it plays out, we'll talk more about that in terms of what it means. And then Einstein, of course, in his classic way, goes on to say that this is more essential than its solution in his elegant way, which may be merely a matter of mathematical or experimental skill. So he's sort of trying to call more attention, if you will, from his side to the formulation of a problem. There are others who have expressed the same idea in different ways. And Medauer, another Nobel laureate, sort of makes this important distinction between what are important versus interesting problems. The main point, he says, that it's not enough that a problem should be interesting. In his view, almost any problem is interesting if it is studied in sufficient depth. So that becomes a thing. Is it interesting? Yes. It's an intrigue versus is the problem such that it matters for what the answer is, whether to science generally or to mankind. So it's not just a question of intrigue, but what he's advocating for is a shift to saying, why would this problem, as you're seeing it, matter? No matter what the answer is, but why would that matter? So he's not conditioning it on the answer. He's saying the problem must be such that it matters what the answer is. So it's not a normative on the conclusion, but have we formulated the problem? Have we set it up in a way that regardless of the answer, there is an advance or a contribution that's made to science generally or to mankind as he sees it. So another Nobel laureate, Herbert Simon, puts it extremely well in contrasting three types of value that the answer to the research question can create. And I do want to drop in one important observation here, that we have introduced the concept of a problem. We have talked about problem formulation, and that's a process, and that the end process of problem formulation is the research question. So I think it's important to differentiate between these three things. Sometimes they might be colloquially treated as interchangeable, but they're actually three very different things: the problem, the formulation of the problem, and the research question. And then furthermore, from the type of value that research question, the answer to the research question might create. One, of course, is the scholarly value, where you advance the area under study in fundamental ways that influence future progress, meaning that, let's say, TC is going to be studying in a related domain. His trajectory of work will be influenced by the answer to the question, let's say, that Anne-Catherine addressed in her research. So in a way, what we're starting to speak about here is that we're affecting the progress of future scholarship in the domain. And that's the assessment in terms of, is there going to be a shift? How substantial? What directional? With stakeholders? And that's really what one is trying to get at with the scholarly contribution. And it might be that you're opening up an entire body of work which attracts a lot of people to it. The second part is practical utility. And here you're getting at, maybe it is around managerial practice, it is around organizational strategy, it's around public policy. So a number of research projects that we undertake have implications, as we refer to them, for the state of affairs in the world. And there are different stakeholders who are managing the state of affairs in the world, be it within organizations, be it within government agencies, not-for-profits, communities, what have you. So the point is, which stakeholders would be managing the state of affairs in the world differently? That comes into the domain of practical utility. And here I would again come back and say that as information systems, digital innovation, artificial intelligence, fields that topics that our community is deeply engaged in, have a number of stakeholders, not just managers in organizations, who might be affected by it. Managers certainly, but beyond that as well. So I do think that's important. And the third point, which is often not brought up, but I find very useful to reflect on, is the notion of aesthetics. The human mind and spirit values aesthetics. Something's beautiful, it appeals and it resonates, and we see it as valuable. And notice that Simon characterizes aesthetics arising from powerful simplicity. He doesn't say simple, he doesn't say powerful, he says powerful simplicity, not powerful complexity, and not just something that's overly simple but not powerful. So I think this notion of powerful simplicity, and you can come back to classic theories and models and ideas that innovators have pushed over time and the scholars have pushed over time, and you can see the powerful simplicity of an E equal to mc squared, F equal to ma in physics, but even in our field and in other fields, you can think about a number of models, etc., which have had powerful simplicity, which takes a complex phenomenon and then brings it down to a form of elegance that we can grapple with effectively. So I'm going to transition to the next segment on my discussion and my remarks here, and that is safeguarding against key risks in formulating research problems. Notice that we talked about, yes, the answer should matter, the problems need to be important, and we have different types of value, the distinction between important and interesting, metaverse, observation. You can sort of use that as orienting comments around the distinction between problem formulation, the research question, and the value of the research question. So the first one is the streetlight effect, and you've seen this elsewhere, including in my editorial. Here's a gentleman who perhaps has had an exciting night out and drops a quarter along the way. And he's pretty busy under that street light looking for that quarter. And the officer comes along and says, did you drop it here? And he says, nope, I didn't, but I'm just looking for it here because the light is better here. So if you turn this into a notion of search, what this is speaking to is that the streetlight effect sometimes might lead us to very quick search choices in the problem formulation process, because you can think about this as a search process where you're making a number of choices. What unit of analysis do I focus on? What constructs or mechanisms do I really want to address? And other things which we'll get into shortly. That search process could be dramatically shortcut because of the streetlight effect. So I want to speak to a few aspects that exacerbate the streetlight effect that we want to be sensitive to. And the first one is just this notion of easy to access data or tools for that matter. Increasingly, we have a number of public benchmark data sets. And the key point here with public benchmark data sets is what available becomes what's studied. And great example of this would be we predict trust from public reviews without engaging theory on reputation or governance, which may have a lot more to inform us about trust and relevant factors that might affect trust. And this is not to say that one should not leverage public benchmark data sets, but the point here is what's available easily becoming the basis for the scholar to short circuit the problem formulation process or make a choice in favor of what's easy versus what's meaningful and important, back to Madaver's point. Another great example related to this is platform-generated trace data. What platforms log becomes is what we explain. And this meaning, for example, we ended up looking at clicks as engagement, and we have seen a lot of the implications of this trickling even in contemporary discourse around social media and the litigations which are currently underway on the damage that's occurred. This is a great example where indeed clicks as engagement were seen as great, while ignoring outcomes and mechanisms which, in hindsight, should have been very carefully construed, not just by the organizations, but also by researchers. We are stakeholders in this process as well. So again, what is easily available um, needs to be considered and used, but I think as scholars, we also have a responsibility and an opportunity here to juxtapose that against what's really important and that other stakeholders in society might not have the incentives or the training for that matter to engage with as deeply. Third example would be pre-trained foundation models, and you can see this today. Indeed, what can be demonstrated easily. We see interest sometimes on prompting an LLM to classify tickets and writing a paper about accuracy. Not saying that's not something one shouldn't get into, but one needs to ask the question. One needs to ask, is this really a key problem, or whether we need to consider the broader organizational problem? Does one need to consider the workflow design or the value risk trade-offs? Like, yes, we end up with high accuracy, but you end up with biases and fairness, for example. So there are important things that we need to come back and say, once one has that data, or once one has that available information, the ease to access shouldn't rush us down to a path of closure or premature closure in formulating the problem. And I'll come back to this point of premature closure. But there's a tendency here, of course, when you have easy to access data sets, you're like, well, I got it, I got to go. And there's premature closure that might occur in the process. Again, I am not advocating at all that these resources need to be hard to access, but I think hopefully the point is clear that the rush to focus on them as the only basis of inquiry is highly limiting. The other aspect would be competency traps. So again, by the notion of search, you can see that when we have our favorite theories, methods, or tools, then we could be subject to tunnel vision. And we're going to see the problem with our favorite, sometimes overused magnifying glass or microscope or what have you. And same with the telescope that our friend there in the boat is sort of looking at, and he's got a certain vantage point there, and the exploration is bounded by very familiar frames. So the point here is that familiar frames can make us very comfortable either in myopic search or even in distant search by how we orient that exploration process. So the point here is to ask the question around whether the frames need enriching or challenging given the nature of the problem at hand. So this is not to say we are all going to be subject to tunnel vision. We are all going to be subject to familiar frames. The point then is, how do we put them into challenge so that we are looking at choices more meaningfully vis-a-vis the problem at hand. So it's not what we have, but really what the problem needs. And this brings me to the second big risk, and that is being solution-driven rather than problem-minded. That is, the solution dictates the question. I have this little graphic here on the side, and you can see this. It's not quite a hammer, but that's the best image I had anyway, so we're running with that. And that's the law of the hammer by Abraham Maslow. And then if you have a hammer, if you have your favorite hammer, then everything looks like a nail, no matter what it is. The problem is essentially framed then to fit the solution, because I already got the hammer, so I have to make it a nail. And rather than being shaped by what the problem itself demands or pulls for, which might be not a hammer, it might actually be a wrench or some other device altogether. So some classic examples here is when a new method is introduced for an unclear or pseudo problem, and people would come back and say, what is the utility? What purpose does this method serve in terms of the broader problem that it could be applied to? The another one is the problem is framed narrowly to showcase a technique that the utility, again, is very much driven by the solution rather than the problem. And you can see that this might manifest in other ways. So all of this to say, this is not about what data or methods we know well. There's clearly an advantage to competency, but it's about a competency trap in terms about starting with an answer and then looking for a question. And I think that is the key issue, not to say that our competencies are obviously going to be there and there could be tremendous sources of advantage. But the point then is, do they align or do they misalign vis-a-vis the problem that one is looking at? The third part I want to get into is the idea of gap spotting and gap patching. And the key issue here is, does the gap matter? So, and you likely have seen this in your PhD seminars and your scholarly submissions as well, that a critical issue is not whether a gap exists, but rather how the gap is formulated. So I'm not suggesting here that the word gap itself is problematic. There's nothing problematic with the word gap. It is around coming back and having a weak framing, which might be something like, no prior study has examined X in context Y. That's it. Now, the issue is that this is very much a gap spotting approach. One steps in and says, there's a gap, I'm going to patch that. I will be study number one that examines X in context Y and hope that you indeed are. But you could formulate or construct the gap through the problem formulation process. In that process, you may come back and say, what is it that we do not still understand about Z that limits theory or practice, and why does it matter? So essentially, you go to formulating and bringing out what we don't know and why that deficit is consequential and motivates the study, that everybody is hungry to understand what and how do you advance research, because this question itself is important. The fourth issue that I'm going to talk about here is this idea of affirming gravity works in my kitchen. And this is a simple way to capture the idea that novelty is a critical component of contribution. And Simon puts it very well, no prizes are awarded for being second to discover a scientific law. I mean, so he does clearly accentuate the novel aspect. Now, notice a few things. That novelty of context by itself, and I want to emphasize the term by itself, sets up potentially for a limited contribution. But if you juxtapose that alongside novelty of understanding as well, to include mechanisms, assumptions, or boundary conditions in that context that are surfaced, you're positioning yourself for a stronger contribution. So again, nobody has studied X in context Y is a novelty of context by itself, whereas novelty of understanding, which is juxtaposed on why X in context Y, raises profoundly consequential issues with respect to whether the assumptions hold in that setting, whether the construct lenses that one has applied hold in that setting, whether the mechanisms are likely to function in the same way, whether the boundary conditions are going to be altered in that setting. And the boundary conditions could be with respect to space. They could be with respect to time. They could be with respect to values of a social nature in that setting. So a deeper engagement with the context vis-a-vis the theoretical design predictive quest that the scholar has becomes really crucial to push that this isn't only novelty of context by itself. And you can see that new contexts matter most when they generate new understanding about the focal IS phenomenon. So if there's a focal IS phenomenon that is concerned with AI biases, I'm taking a contemporary topic right now, or AI fairness, and we say we are going to investigate this in a new context, let's say in an educational setting, in a different cultural context, or in a different institutional context, where the access to data through institutional records might be vastly different from another setting which has better or institutional records that interact with in a privacy preserving way with an AI agent. And the institutional records may have a lot of information about students, which the AI records, and again, all privacy preserving, can sort of leverage in the process. So again, what you're getting at here is not just saying, here's a new context, does this work or no, but rather you're getting into pushing the boundaries of knowledge vis-a-vis the new context and its distinctive features that are likely to be there. Again, I do want to emphasize out here that if indeed your objectives are replication, there are different genres of replication research. One is literal replication, where you just come back and say, I expect X to hold in setting Y, which is new. And this is because, it's not exactly literal replication now because you're replicating it in a different setting. It's not, but this is a contextual replication. And you may find that indeed there are breakdowns or no. So again, affirming gravity works in my kitchen if you're pushing to advance knowledge of a certain type and you disengage with the context, then there is a substantial opportunity cost to that. And that's my main point here. The next part that I want to get at is a very crucial one in my mind, and all of these things tie together pretty well. And this is the idea of the relationship between the forest and the trees. As you will see this as I go through my comments on this segment, it is as important that we don't miss the forest for the trees as it is that we don't miss distinctive aspects of certain foliage or trees as we look at the panorama of the forest. And I'll get at both of these aspects shortly. And I'm going to take a contemporary example again, and to set up the tension between two things that I think we contend with. And that is the tension between an archetypal problem and a novel instantiation of it. To my left, you see, let's say, digital coordination as a phenomenon, as a broader phenomenon. And to the right, we say agentic coordination as a more novel instantiation of digital coordination. Through IS research and other research, we have accreted a reasonable amount of knowledge on digital coordination of virtual teams through enterprise systems, among other technologies and methods. Now, the point here is that in looking at agentic coordination, there is obviously novel aspects that lead this to be a novel instantiation of this broader class of problems, digital coordination. The point now, of course, is how do you put together and juxtapose the higher archetypal problem, which is of a more fundamental nature, to the more emergent problem or the novel instantiation within that class. So this tension is absolutely crucial to the problem formulation process. Now, let me work through this. The two potential fracture lines, and that's my attempt to show a fracture line here. So in that tension is that you can end up with an over-tethering to the novel instantiation. So to neglecting the archetypal problem altogether, taking an extreme situation. Okay. So what ends up happening here is a scholar interested in agentic coordination would not draw on, in this case, models and theories, mechanisms, prior assumptions, and boundary conditions that over a cumulative process in the community, there's substantial body of knowledge that's developed. And therefore, the risk becomes one of reinvention and possibly even so risk of old wine, new bottle outcome. The way in which this is studied might essentially come across as, but this is what you're saying here about agentic AI coordination is no different than, and there is that risk. There is that risk that happens. So the issue here is not that this risk is not a real risk, but how do you manage it upfront in the problem formulation process? So the other side, extreme of managing this tension, is one over abstracts. You totally over abstract away from the novel instantiation. And you say, well, it's just another case of digital coordination, much like enterprise systems. And you can see now that what has happened here is that sole focus on abstraction has led to a loss of distinctive features pertaining to the agentic AI coordination instantiation. So, for example, what fails to travel up to collide against or interact with or relate with the archetypal problem is how coordination mechanisms change under non-human agency. Which assumptions embedded in digital coordination theories no longer hold? And where existing boundary conditions need to be revised or extended. These are examples of things that may not travel up to interact with the knowledge base out here. Therefore, the consequences that insights are locked in this instantiation do not inform the broader understanding and knowledge accretion of digital coordination, and it's a lost opportunity at minimum. And the contribution potentially might be seen as not influencing the broader and important phenomenon of digital coordination within which different technologies need to challenge what's known to advance us forward. So the notion around this is not that it is not new, but rather how is this tension between the abstraction to the concrete or the novel instantiation and the novel instantiation to the abstraction managed by the scholar. This is crucial. So this brings me to the key point here that managing the archetype instantiation tension. Let's take the example of agentic AI coordination is a novel instantiation of the archetypal digital coordination problem. And we need to then ask how it fits, stretches, or reshapes that entire archetype. That's a problem formulation choice. So now what you're coming back and saying is, given this from a scholarly standpoint, we have all of this practical stuff that's happening. And some of you had asked this question around things that are happening very rapidly in practice. Well, that's fantastic. It gives us an opportunity here to engage with and significantly challenge what's known out here to make rapid advances if necessary, if necessary. Drawing on, challenging, extending, reshaping our understanding around digital coordination because of the novelty of agentic AI coordination. So problem formulation becomes the skill then of managing the tension between archetypal problems and distinctive contexts or distinctive instantiations. And that choice shapes both the question we ask and the contribution we make. So well-formulated problems, if you think about it, then enable insights to traverse downward from accreted knowledge, up as contribution, and then forward over time as a sustainable research stream. Today, it's agentic AI coordination. It might move to something else. And you're like, okay, that's good. I've been engaging with the digital coordination, broader literature, domain knowledge, that I understand the ontology, the epistemology, the accreted knowledge in this domain space. And I have contributed to it through agentic AI coordination. And you'll be well positioned as we go towards advanced research within this space or with other related spaces to engage with that. So this thing around, do I stand a risk of working in something that's fast fleeting or that may be seen as novel today and then outdated? This is more likely to occur if it is studied in a very narrow way and not in a way which is likely to be sustaining of a research stream. So again, it comes down to managing this archetypal or the fundamental problem or the class of problems that one is engaged in and keeping that in center. So the sixth point is actually, there's not much for me to say on this. I think Goldilocks captured it really well, so there's not much for me to say on this. That in a lot of our research, when we are looking at, how much do I bite in terms of constructs, abstraction versus what's in my novel instantiation of a problem, this is about going through the usual iterations around too little, too much, just right. And all I'm going to encourage you to do is that this is very much contingent on the status of a domain in terms of what is seen as a contribution. And as a field emerges, and let's just say, I'm going to use an equation, let's just say we have very high explained variance around a critical outcome like customer satisfaction. And you come back and then say, yeah, I am going to add another variable which barely changes it or changes it at a marginal, it changes it at a significant level, not really that consequential. You likely are going to get pushback from that community of scholars. So McGrath captures and colleagues capture it very well. Is it too narrow that you're seeking to know everything about nothing? Okay, or is it too diffuse, seeking to know nothing about everything? And I think this sort of captures it when you have these very broad scoped questions or these extremely narrow questions. You have to put it against a community metaphor and say, what is that community of scholars going to think about it at that point in time? And I think you have to engage in that process. And communities like DITE that you have, actually a great forum for one to ideate around, am I sort of going about it initially at a reasonable scope? And these scope questions adjust through the course of interaction and conduct of a research project or program. The next point that I want to make, and this is the final risk that I wanted to sort of get at, and that is the premature closure in problem formulation. Again, I'll stick with my agentic AI example. Let's say here's a case of classic premature closure. Let's build agentic AI, and the solution is let's build a fully autonomous agent to handle everything. Okay, so you can play this out and say, here, this is what we sort of rush off to build, and you can think about this in theoretical terms as well. But there are very crucial agentic AI design questions that might have been shortcut in the process. What is the task structure? What level of autonomy is actually required in this setting? And that's reasonable. Where should humans and human override sit in this process? So we might, in that process, overlook a number of AI solution pieces that are critical for us to consider in our thought process. Do we need specialized AI agents, not just one for everything? Do we need AI advisory support where either the AI agent is where the human is serving as a critical advice input resource to the agent in the process? So a point here simply is that premature closure and leads to this thing around very early cognitive closure based on the initial diagnosis of what one thinks is the problem. So in problem formulation, a lot of it is around initial diagnosis or diagnosis of the problem. And you can see that right from the way we thought about the agentic AI problem to more accreted state of knowledge, that initial diagnosis is very, very crucial that one vet that and say, is there premature closure? In fact, diagnostic errors have been shown to contribute substantially to adverse medical events, with nearly 30% driven by cognitive failures, premature closure chief among them. So in medicine, among other fields, including scholarship, we see this to occur. So the next set of slides offer you a few suggestions on generating diverse problem formulations with some practices. One of them is the idea of cross-paradigm combinative practices, and I have shared an editorial on this topic again with you. I'm not going to get into this in any detail, but I'll simply say this, that when I say cross-paradigm practices, it could be cross-paradigm theoretical perspectives where you have, let's say, let me just take examples that might work better, is that you have, behavioral and economic theories that are combined as one example. You have theoretical perspective and method that comes from a different domain that are combined. And you can see increasingly a number of computational methods, including artificial intelligence-based methods, are being rapidly combined into behavioral and economics and design IS research. And you can similarly see that you have paradigm-centric methods that might be enriched with theoretical perspectives from other domains. And similarly, you can end up combining methods of different sorts. And what ends up happening in this recombination process, as we have seen with innovation, is that it leads to a number of options that might be totally overlooked in how one thinks about the problem. And I think that's the key point that I wanted to make here. Another consideration for us to think about is that problem formulation is not a one and done process. We've talked about a number of choices, and yes, you can go through iteration and manage for premature closure, try to manage that stress between a number of the issues like abstraction and novel instantiation that I've spoken about. But there's another thing, and that is just iterative learning through actual interventions and doing an action and experiments. So what you could end up happening, what we are seeing, of course, is the scaling of this process, scaling that learning as we end up in worlds of artificial intelligence and digital platforms. We have an opportunity in scientific inquiry to scale our understanding of the problem and the solution space iteratively. So it's not that the problem space itself doesn't change with solutions. It does, but sort of going through this high frequency, high throughput process where you have a lot of subjects, let's say in an experiment, with high frequency, and we're seeing a number of companies today move in that direction. Governments, in thinking about scientific infrastructure in the age of AI, are also trying to push us in this direction. If you think what happened with AlphaFold and the Nobel Prize winners last year, they essentially, along with colleagues at DeepMind, they sort of had this notion around using AI and other tools in synthetic data and experiments to scale the learning process of protein structure discovery. So I think we are at that point that, again, human expertise is obviously hugely crucial, but we also are having tools and methods and resources that are becoming available to us to expedite and accelerate the scale and scope of problem formulation, not in a lumpy way, but in a lean way and a more iterative process. And I just want to put that out for our consideration as we move forward. The next point I want to make is just the simple idea. I'll finish my segment here on safeguarding against risk and problem formulation is being disciplinary while being interdisciplinary. And I'm going to say very little about it for now. I do think that one of the things that comes up sometimes in research is what is IS research? And obviously, this is a socially constructed concept, right? Like what the boundaries of a field shift as they should. The boundaries of phenomena shift as they will. So we have shifting boundaries of digital phenomena. What we need to figure out is how do we formulate problems with IS in foreground? What does the community consider to be central aspects of IS? And we develop that understanding through engagement with our journals, through engagement in peer review processes, through engagement in communities like DITE and others, and through our conferences, where we figure out what is it that IS scholars are deeply engaged with when it comes to certain digital phenomena. And you can see that happening today in a big way with AI, where there are a number of opportunities for scholars to think about this phenomena, and which is changing the boundaries. Excuse me. Of digital phenomena, of course, right? I mean, today we have non-human agents capable of human-like activities, not just speech, but voice, but physical action, whatever. And how is that changing the formulation for IS research itself? Great question. But what is pivotal is that this occur front and center. So we are able to say we make disciplinary IS contributions while contributing to other disciplines. So I love this notion around being disciplinary while being interdisciplinary. So if you're sending a manuscript to an IS journal, it has to resonate with that community. And the onus is as much as on the editorial and review side as it is with the authors, but to figure out that we don't have fixed frames or boundaries in a way that reject good ideas or that we overlook them. That's my position on this. So the last point here that I'm going to get into is chance favoring the connected mind. Now, if you go to Louis Pasteur's saying, in the fields of observation, chance favors only those minds which are prepared. And this will bring us to maybe a preparation model, much like Sir Isaac Newton, which worked extremely well. And this is not to say that the prepared mind is obviously a huge resource and an asset to a scholar. But waiting for the apple to strike while you are anticipating it and preparing in an individual isolated sense, and consider this as a contrast. And by the way, this is a great book by Stephen Johnson, where good ideas come from, if anybody's interested. And there is the idea of the connected mind. And this is actually a salon outside of Oxford where a number of scholars sort of sit around and they talk and they interact with each other. Maybe sort of like what we are doing. We are not in Oxford and we are not in a salon or in a bar right now, but I mean, the metaphor is that what you go away from is a process of individual preparation and search as a process of retrieval from knowledge bases and individual triggers of imagination. But rather, we look at a networked and collaborative process. Wenping or Yan or TC sort of say something, and that changes Nora's search process in terms of what she thinks about, let's say, an assumption, or about a focal construct, or about a boundary condition in the process. So what ends up happening is that this networked and collaborative process could provide triggers and acceptation opportunities for the progression of the problem formulation search process. And the other notion that in terms of connected mind that Andrew Pettigrew has put very well is research with practice to advance scientific knowledge and practical utility. So for those that are interested in research with, notice he says research with, not for practice. So this is not in a privileged position saying, I'm doing this for you, you now go do it. But rather it is with practice because there are complementary resources that each brings to the table in the problem formulation process. Notice that Andrew Pettigrew's notion is about problem formulation and engagement with research process, with practice at that stage, and not at the dissemination stage. He argues clearly that dissemination is too late because now you're in a translation process and saying, here's the knowledge, I need to translate it into your vocabulary so that you can use it. But that's a very different frame than saying we have different vantage points in terms of how we could consider the problem. So the final point I want to make, and then I'm done, is this notion around developing the connected mind. Back to Herbert Simon. This is a really interesting notion, right? He says it is not merely a matter, Herbert Simon likes to use the word merely often, a matter of constituting a team with members having complementary specializations in knowledge and skills. Just means like, again, some members, Nora, TC, Shariga, etc., they have different skills and you say, and knowledge, and you put them in a team. But that's not going to do it. But what he says here is it is very important for people to become somewhat multidisciplinary. So it's not overlap knowledge, but it's not completely redundant knowledge, but there's sufficient understanding for that integration to occur, right? Otherwise, what ends up happening is you have the potential for complementarity, but absent that connective tissue, it's not going to happen. And that's the key point that he sort of made. How does a connected mind happen? It's not just by dropping a bunch of people who don't have any development of a shared multidisciplinary knowledge, and each one would have their points of specialization, but that connective tissue, that common base, becomes extremely crucial in these knowledge processes. So that sort of brings me to the end of my comments. I apologize if I've gone a little over, but thank you very much. Yeah.